Ladies and gentlemen, the ideology that threatens free speech today, at least in the United States, and has the potential to ruin our society is a different one. It's not foreign and it's not Islamic. It goes by many names, but I will call it wokeism.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, esteemed students, dear Ayaan, it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you here to the 20th Reichmuth lecture tonight at the University of Lucerne and the Institute of Swiss Economic Policy. I notice with great pleasure that such a large number of guests have joined us today to listen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And I think you did so with good reasons. It is one of the rare occasions when you can experience Ayaan live in Switzerland. And you will immediately realize she is both a fascinating and courageous personality. What she's saying is not just plain theory, but full of life and of own experiences. Ayaan is a leading and visionary feminist, if I may say so. She thoroughly fights for freedom of speech and for women's rights, both outside of the Western world as well as within the Western world. And that is exactly the topic of today's lecture. Ayaan was born in Somalia in 1969. In the early 1990s, she flew to Netherlands after a very complicated journey. Initially, she worked as a translator and interpreter for the Dutch judicial, social and immigration authorities. From 1995 to 2000, she studied political science at Leiden University. Ayaan began publishing and publicly criticizing fundamentalist, extremist view of Islam. She changed her party affiliation from the Social Democratic Labour Party to the People's Party of Freedom and Democracy, for which she was elected to Parliament in 2003. Because of her political commitment, she received death threats. In 2007, she moved to the US and founded the AHA Foundation. Currently, she's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. She works for the American Enterprise Institute, and she was a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. She has received numerous and prestigious awards around the globe for her work and for her courage. My esteemed colleague René, who is now here, for goodness sake, will now briefly introduce to today's lecture. Afterwards, we will be enjoying your talk, the talk of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and then we will enter into a question and answer session where you, of course, will have the opportunity to ask your own questions if you may so. So I'll glad to hand over to my esteemed colleague René.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Ayaan, dear Christoph, thank you for your kind words. Ayaan Hirsi Ali. One might think a name says it all. Yet there is no set agenda with corny statements. Ayaan always takes on the most topical issues. She is on the frontier of discussions. Whenever she speaks, there is no bullshitting. Ayaan doesn't use any empty phrases. She thinks it through. She's a brilliant intellectual, she's a writer, she's a feminist, she's a mother, she's the opposite of a faker. She does not speak from an academic ivory tower above the clouds. Instead, she's rooted in reality. She's based on the search of truth. She's fearless, and she acts and speaks softly, calmly, clearly, and distinctly. Dear Ayaan, welcome to Lucerne. Until recently, we in the West probably lived in the freest society of all times. But that doesn't mean anything, because freedom is a strange thing. You strive for it when you don't have it. You no longer feel it once you have it, and you only notice it again when you no longer have it. Ayaan will talk about free speech in the West today. Or more precisely, what about free speech in the West? Framing it as a question is crucial here, because freedom cannot be taken for granted. To put it bluntly, frivolity and freedom don't mix well. Freedom allows for frivolity, but too much frivolity and freedom is in retreat. Not only that freedom cannot be taken for granted, freedom is complicated and demanding too. Freedom goes hand in hand with responsibility. And that's exhausting, of course. But it also comes with pain. Being free to think what you want to think and to say what you think and to do what you say, well, you can offend others. Ayaan, you once said, I quote, "Freedom of speech is the right to offend within the bounds of the law. Polite conversations, good manners, you do that during weddings, during dinners, you remember, when you are socializing with one another, and your main intent in these events is not to offend one another. It's to observe etiquette. But in a civilized society, you sometimes have to share ideas or oppose and criticize ideas and policies of others, knowing that these who feel opposed might be offended." End of quote. This is a strong statement and a crystal clear view. Civilized is not someone who spares others. That's what conformists do. Being civilized means to distinguish between people and opinions and to put up with hurting the convictions of others without wanting to hurt them, precisely because you say what you think. Ideas, views, beliefs can hurt, and yes, they may even shall do so, because only then social progress is possible. Arguing is the essence of things, especially of human interactions. But such arguing must be strictly separated, both from defamation of any kind and from the passive-aggressive behavior of an increasing number of our fellow citizens. For arguing, you need instead courage. That's why we are here tonight. We are keen to hear how Ayaan sees our situation, our time, our present. So, what about free speech in the West? Ayaan, the floor is yours.
René, thank you very, very much for those kind words and for the flattery. Thank you, Christoph and Christoph. Once I went to Denmark, and the first two people I met were Rasmussen and Rasmussen. And I think maybe there is a large number of Christophs in Switzerland. I also want to thank the Institute for Swiss Economic Policy for making this possible. I'm incredibly pleased and thrilled to be here It's not my first time in Switzerland. I've been here many times, but each time I come to Switzerland, it feels like the first time. I'm always humbled by the nature and what you, the Swiss, have done within it. To civilize it and modernize it and tame it and live within it without violating it. I'm not quite sure what I think of this building. But that's a discussion for another time. So this evening, we come together, and René asked me when he approached me to pose the question, what about free speech in the West? So in 1989, for those of you as old as me, you will remember that the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran issued a fatwa against the British author Salman Rushdie for a novel he wrote titled The Satanic Verses. This event sparked a debate between the West, or Western civilization, and Islam, or the Islamic civilization, about the boundaries of speech. Back then, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of Britain, and I have chosen a quote written by Charles Moore, a journalist who wrote her biography. And here's what she said when she was confronted with the fact that Salman Rushdie's politics were different from hers. She said, whether or not we have any sympathy with Rushdie's views is not the point. We must react strongly to any state's murder hunt made against one of our citizens. The author, Rushdie, and the politician, Thatcher, were on either side of the left-right political spectrum, but she pointed out the irrelevance of political differences, and she was solid in her conviction that the protection of the author is a matter of principle rather than politics. So now it's very interesting to look back at the last 3 decades in the West and to see how attitudes to free speech have changed dramatically. 3 things in that timeline. First, back then, during that Rushdie affair, free speech, or the assault to free speech, was seen as something foreign. It came from outside. Even though many commentators blamed Rushdie for provoking the ire of the Ayatollah, but the intolerance of speech to the point of seeking to murder the offender was something that came from outside of the West. And back then, it was thought, maybe even taken for granted, that Westerners, Americans, Europeans, Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, it was taken for granted that Westerners had reached almost perfect consensus on the matter of saying, inquiring, writing, publishing, painting, drawing, singing, and producing any kind of content that they wanted. It was left to the audiences to pay attention to what they wanted to ignore or what they wanted to consume. Yeah, sure, there were still controversies on what content might be regarded as offensive. Western citizens sued their governments, and they sued one another, especially in America, on grounds such as defamation, libel, and slander. But key, they always accepted the final verdict of the courts. The idea that offensive speech was to be punished with fines, time in prison, or capital punishment, as in Rushdie's case, was thought of in the West as something foreign or something from the annals of history. Like we used to do that back then. We don't do that anymore. Even better, on the matter of fictional output, such as movies and novels, anyone who felt aggrieved enough to complain to the courts was viewed as a narrow-minded loser. Matters of fact, that is, non-fiction works, were reviewed based on such criteria as evidence, logical rigor, and coherence, rather than emotional standards. When I came to the Netherlands 30 years ago, that was the Western society that I found. Free, tolerant, and prosperous. Not perfect, but free, tolerant, and prosperous. The second thing that stands out in that timeline, in those 3 decades, is the response that Western society gave to the religious intolerance exhibited by some members of Muslim communities who live in the West. There was heinous murder of Theo van Gogh. There was the killing of the Charlie Hebdo journalists. There was the crazed reaction to the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in Denmark and in France. There was and continues to be the relentless threats against Muslims who choose to leave their faith like me, who criticized its intolerant and violent components. At first, the native populations of Europe and the United States reacted to this intolerance with horror. Most Westerners condemned the people who took offense as intolerant and backward. It is true, a number of commentators from the media, politics, and the universities chastised those allegedly guilty of the provocation and urged the wider society to be patient with their Muslim minorities. It doesn't matter on which side you are. In any case, the assault on the freedom of speech and conscience of those accused of the provocation was seen as narrow in scope. Muslims were seen as a minority, new to the West, for whom religious identity is salient and who will one day learn the virtues of freedom and tolerance. And a key feature of this threat was that this particular minority seemed to want to silence only critics of their religion. They didn't want to interfere in other matters. So the solution by Western leaders was, hey, stay clear, steer clear of anything that could possibly antagonize the religious sensibility of any Muslim individual or group. Do that for as long as it takes this minority to catch up with the rest of the West. If that's not a perfect solution, but a containment strategy, then so be it. For some problems, there is no such a thing as a perfect solution. Matter settled. Taken together, you could say that Western leaders concluded to stand up to A, any foreign threats to our freedoms, and B, to manage the intolerance within the Muslim communities with patience and as needed. Is that the end of the story? It should be, but it's not. We lulled ourselves into a false sense of security. For while we were distracted by Islamist intolerance, Islamist terrorism, and maybe the demands of daily life, other forms of intolerance were being seeded and cultivated in our universities, in our schools, in our media, in our healthcare facilities, in our administrative government, in our political parties, and in our large corporations. Ladies and gentlemen, the ideology that threatens free speech today, at least in the United States, and has the potential to ruin our society is a different one. It's not foreign, and it's not Islamic. It goes by many names, but I will call it wokeism. Wokeism, say those who have studied it, is an amalgam of postmodernist theories. I highly recommend the works of British author Helen Pluckrose and American mathematician James Lindsay if you need a primer to what wokeism is, especially their book, Cynical Theories. Mad minds like Jean-François Lyotard, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Foucault cooked up the original woke potion in France because they were disappointed with the fruits of the Enlightenment. American scholars, many of them Black, built their activism against racism, perceived or real, on this shaky house of theories. Legal scholar Derek Bell developed it further and centered it around race. What was critical theory became critical race theory. Kimberly Crenshaw, another Black scholar, seasoned it with something she called intersectionality. Aggrieved members of the gay community expanded these ideas further, and intellectual con men and con women like Robin DiAngelo and Ibrahim X. Kendi monetized it. One reason why it's difficult to pin down wokeism is that their theories of deconstruction are constantly expanded with grievance after grievance. They claim to possess a skepticism that deconstructs existing meta-narratives that favor groups who hold up power and the structures they set up to maintain that power. But then, the woke reject the skepticism of the scientific revolution, that of the pursuit of inquiring using objective criteria to get to the bottom of things or the truth, and then embarking on the process of bringing about the necessary changes. In other words, they, the woke, they have their own meta-narrative. And its objective is to deconstruct society into pieces. Literally. Race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and whatever they might come up with tomorrow. Sometimes, I think this ambiguity is intentional. Because if you can pin an idea down, you can expose it and accept its conclusions or reject them. But if its meaning keeps shifting with the grievance of the day, it becomes elusive. It is now social justice theory. Weirdly, it's not theory at all. For one, you can't treat it like other theories. That is, by taking it through the process of scrutiny, falsification, or verification. They won't accept that. Another key element is the contamination of language. Wokeism comes with its own lexicon, its own dictionary. You may have heard woke speak. Words like microaggressions, safe spaces, equity, diversity, non-binary, cultural appropriation. It also has its bureaucratic acronyms: DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion; ESG, environmental and social governance; LGBTQRST, you get the idea. And even more sinister ones now, like MAPS or MAPS, minor attracted persons. Let that sink in. What we used to call pedophilia is now minor attracted person. And it's a civil rights cause. Just think about that. But our existing language is constantly policed to become purified of any perceived bigotry and injustice, understood only as the woke understand these things. The main goal of the woke is to seek unchecked and absolute power, advancing from the academy and out into the other institutions of society and even into the streets. In America and the rest of the English-speaking world, there is no issue of any significance that we can discuss in any meaningful way without running into woke sabotage. Think about the challenges we face, from globalization, national identity and immigration, inequality, healthcare, radical Islam, the pandemic, climate change, the threat of authoritarian great powers like China and Russia, new technologies such as AI, artificial intelligence, and the opportunities and threats they introduce. None of these issues is free of woke speak. And in almost every case, we tend to bend towards where the arc of wokeness leads. Deconstruction instead of construction and reconstruction. Wokeism today, in my view, is a greater threat to free speech in America than the discredited and defeated ideology of white supremacy. It's a greater threat to free speech in America than Islamism. It's a greater threat to free speech in America than any other contemporary ideology. I want to make it very clear that Islamism and white supremacy still pose significant threats to free speech and to the other principles of an open society, such as tolerance, pluralism, and democracy. An update on Salman Rushdie's plight will disabuse you of the kind of complacence towards radical Islam in general and fatwas in particular. Just 2 months ago, Rushdie was attacked while giving a talk at a literary festival in Chappaqua in New York State. He lost an eye and the use of a hand. White supremacists have opened fire in places where large numbers of people gather and killed substantial numbers of people. So those threats are not gone, they're there. And I'm under no illusion that the threats of these two sources is done with. I just want to make it clear that in the hierarchy of threats to free speech, open debate, and tolerance, they've been knocked off the top position by the ideology of wokeism. Just think about this. If the federal government were adopting the language of white supremacy, if the police units of some of the most powerful states in the US were adjusting to their demands, if our military was holding white supremacy conscious training sessions, if our most prominent national sports teams were using white supremacy gestures, if Hollywood and other entertainment industries were editing their output or censoring it, and at times running propaganda for the cause of white supremacy. Imagine if elementary and high schools or universities were openly teaching the principles of white supremacy. What would we say? Or any other gathering, what would we say, meaning this gathering, what would you say, what would we say in America? Or think about this. What if the federal government were adopting the language of the Islamists? If the police units of some of the most powerful states in American society were adjusting to their demands? What if our military was holding Islamist conscious training sessions? What if our most prominent national sports teams were using Islamist gestures? If Hollywood and other entertainment industries were editing their output or censoring it, and at times running propaganda for the cause of Islamism? If elementary and high schools or universities were openly teaching the principles of Islamism, what would we say? In fact, in the last 20 years or so, all these things have happened, but they were met with resistance. Today, in none of these institutions is white supremacy tolerated. Today, Islamists in America are tolerated, but they do not have that kind of powerful hold on our society. Sadly, however, wokeism is the trending, rotten idea of our time, and it's embedded in almost every institution in America. Wokeism and its narratives or theories are dividing us again into hostile factions. It's weakening our hard-earned freedom and faith in each other. It's threatening the future of our children and our planet. For those of us who recognize it as the threat it is, I believe we have no option but to fight it in just the way we fought the other bad ideologies such as white supremacy and Islamism. In fact, in a spooky way, wokeism has remarkable similarities with white supremacy and with Islamism. Wokeism is inherently hostile to women and gay people. And worst of all, in practice, wokeism ruins the lives of those who live with gender dysphoria. In what way, you might ask? Like white supremacists, the woke rank human beings into races, with the white-skinned people still on top, except this time as the top oppressors of all other races. In the woke rankings, as in the white supremacist ideology, various shades of skin color are distinguished. Some brown-skinned people, the woke tell us, are white adjacent, but blacks are still placed at the bottom, this time as the ultimate victims. According to the woke, merit, punctuality, hard work, hygiene, individualism, objective truth, and the notion of lifting up yourself by your bootstraps, all these things are manifestations of whiteness. Now ponder that. That, of course, implies that mediocrity, tardiness, laziness, filth, tribalism, superstition, and lack of ambition are inherently the traits of non-white peoples. If that's not racism, tell me what's racism. Colonialism, as was practiced by whites, the British and the French and the Spanish, the Portuguese and the Dutch, that's all scrutinized for all kinds of sins of oppression and condemned. But non-white empires, the Han Chinese, the Mughals, the Muslim empires, and their barbarities are ignored. America's past of holding slaves and America's treatment of indigenous peoples is constantly litigated, but Black and brown people's role in slavery, in producing slaves, in trading slaves, and still perpetuating it to this day is completely ignored. According to the worldview of the woke, only white people are capable of reckoning with their history. Only white people are fit enough to be held accountable for their actions. If that is not racism, you tell me what is racism. The woke and the white supremacists are both anti-Semitic. If you're Jewish, you're categorized by them as whites. Never mind that in this continent, just 77 years ago, a serious attempt was made to eliminate all Jews because they were considered pollutants to the white race. Think about that. The woke hate the state of Israel, and they freely indulge in conspiracy theories about the Jews. They've got to be called out. But the woke also have similarities with Islamism. Like Islamists, the woke are allergic to free speech, academic freedom, and the pursuit of objective truth. Like Islamists, they turn their followers into those who command right and forbid wrong, constantly virtue signaling, silencing, and canceling those they disagree with, menacing and threatening people with dire consequences to be meted out by the supreme authority of ultimate morality. You might think that perhaps the woke are not yet as violent as the most radical of Islamists. I reckon it's only a matter of time. So far in the United States, we have been treated to the stunts of an outfit called Antifa, or anti-fascists. True to the nature of excelling in woke contradictions, Antifa operate in thuggish groups with face coverings who beat up people, break things, and act as militias of a totalitarian ideology. Woke are misogynist. They hate women. The word woman is to be so upsetting to them as to erase it altogether. We are now to be categorized as people who menstruate, birthing people, chest feeders. Our hard-won spaces are to be compromised. Women-only hospital wards, toilets, locker rooms, prisons, and domestic violence shelters are to be invaded by men who look like and act like grizzly bears on the flimsy basis that they identify as women. Our elite sports competitions are to allow men to come in and compete on the same basis. Homosexuals don't fare much better with the woke. Their fight for justice is so recent, we all remember it because it's still ongoing and fraught with obstacles. But to the woke, they're just another set of pawns in their quest for absolute power. Gays and lesbians are targeted before they even come out of the closet, and they are told they're in the wrong body and must transition in haste, only to regret at leisure. People with actual gender dysphoria, the tiniest of all minorities, are set up against everyone else. The woke have now created conditions in which people with possible gender dysphoria are pitted against women. That's half the human population, against gays and the wider society. How does this benefit this minority? That's not the sort of question the woke ask. All they want is power, absolute, unchecked power. And if vulnerable individuals are to be sacrificed in the process, they don't care. Ladies and gentlemen, the woke must be subjected to the best qualities of the freedom of speech. They must be checked. They must be questioned. They must be scrutinized. They must be offended and ultimately stopped in their pathetic tracks. I will take your questions now.
So thank you very much, Ayaan, for this brilliant talk and for your thought-provoking ideas. Before we enter into asking people in the public or in the audience, let me give the chance to have an own question. John Stuart Mill, the great philosopher, wrote in his opus magnum on liberty, if all mankind, minus one, were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. What are your thoughts about that? Is he right?
So in 1869, when he was writing that, Europe and the West looked different. He was preaching to the West. He was trying to get the idea across that freedom of speech, offensive speech, controversial theories and ideas are more beneficial if we let them be than if we censor. And then fast forward, this is the story I'm trying to tell you. 30 years ago when I came here, I thought that was settled. I thought that John Stuart Mill had achieved what he set out to achieve in the West. And now it's being challenged. And it's being challenged, yes, from the outside, by another civilization, radical Islam. But it's now we have to deal and contend with what's coming out of our universities. Maybe it hasn't hit Switzerland. But in America, my husband and I have started an initiative with a number of philanthropists to start a new university because the existing Ivy League universities are not providing the kind of platform that you would comply, say, with John Stuart Mill's proposal. Kids in universities are saying, I can't discuss what I want. I can't say what I want. Faculty is being cancelled and censored. This isn't coming from the outside. This is coming from the inside.
And what do you think, why this movement of intolerance right now? Is this a sign of decadence, or what would you think? I mean, it's astonishing.
Yeah. I think what we did was, again, I go back to complacence. We've been complacent. When I was in the University of Leiden between 1995 to 2000, there were groups, individuals, the odd professor who indulged in this sort of thing, and we just thought they were on the fringe, benign, laughable, sometimes a nuisance. We never took it seriously. And I think it's the same in the United States, where the problem is at its biggest and it's being exported back to Europe. We never took it seriously. But to answer the question that you've just posed in a rigorous manner, I think it's worth it to go back and see exactly what happened. What happened with the humanities? I was taught again, political science, my professors would say, you've got to read the material, analyze it, criticize it, and then come up with what you think is a better answer to the social question or the political question that's posed here. That's not what we're teaching our kids now.
So let's open the discussion to the audience. Is there somebody who wants to be icebreaker?
Yes, but I think we know from the history of collectivist ideologies, they always go for the university. You have young, impressionable people, they're brilliant, and they are going to be the leaders of society when they're done with their studies in school. They'll be the leaders of churches, they'll be the leaders of politics, of businesses, of nonprofits, and so on and so forth. So if you have an ideology to propagate, you start at the universities. I think that's not surprising. And we know that from Marxism. We actually even know that from Islamism. Islamism, if you look at the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, it was all seeded in the University of Al-Azhar in Cairo. If you go to Indonesia, if you go to Pakistan, if you go to any of these places, it starts within the institutions of learning. That is how you can create a large number of people to follow you unquestioningly and to be the advancers of the cause, either verbally through their discourses, through their expressions, or ultimately through the justification of the use of violence. My response to this is you misunderstand the situation. Within the Republican Party, there is a fringe, and they are to the right, sometimes far right, extreme, sometimes extremely religious, and very intolerant. And within the Democratic Party, you also have a fringe, and they go to the left and the far left. And I think that if you look at the two parties, the woke have infiltrated the Democratic Party more than any other institution, and that's how they get into government. The normal cut and thrust of everyday politics between Republicans and Democrats, I think, is what we call polarization. In my view, I don't mind that at all. I think in a democratic society, you do need, you need to have disagreements, you need to have clear-cut ideas. What I object to, and where I think the woke are different, so don't confuse polarization with the problem that I'm talking about. Because for the disagreement, whether it's within a political party or between political parties, the idea is that you should be able to express it without punishment. The woke, as they present themselves in universities, in government, in every institution, is you cannot disagree with them. If you disagree with them, you're going to be cancelled. There's going to be dogpiling in social media. You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your reputation. You'll be vilified. That's not how a tolerant, pluralistic, liberal society operates. So I don't mind disagreeing with anyone from the Republican or Democratic Party, but the minute they try to silence me, I think it's going to be very important to point out if it becomes significant. And I think where you and I disagree is, I am saying the woke as an ideology and as a movement is more significant than we think. Well, it depends on what I'm asked to tolerate. If you think the moon is made of cheese, I'll tolerate that. I will not interfere with that. I think in America they say everybody has the right to his own idiocy or something like that. But if you're asking for us to vote on rules, laws, I'll give you an example. Young children. who feel confused about their bodies before the age of 18, who want to belong amongst their peers, and who get the idea, maybe I'm not a woman, maybe I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, I must change myself. We have, as a society, and this is, I think, what makes Western society unique, is we tend to err on the side of protecting the vulnerable, children, women, minorities, etc. If such a child has to go behind the parents' back, go to medical institutions and gets hormone treatment and gets, ultimately the removal of parts of the anatomy, that's the sort of thing I would say, before we go to that extreme, let's have an open debate. Let's hear both sides or all sides of the argument. And that's the problem with the woke. They're saying when you do that, when you say let's hear all sides of the argument, you are the bigoted one, you are intolerant. You are in the way of this child engaging in gender affirmation. Now, this has been allowed for a while, and now here we have individuals coming out at a later age and saying, I regret it. I never wanted these parts of my body to, I was confused. But you can't put those parts back again. I'm horrified by female gender mutilation as much as I am horrified by this sort of nonsense. And I'm not censoring anyone. I'm just saying, let's have the market of ideas where we listen to every expert tell us what the pluses and minuses are, what the pros and cons are. Let's be able to talk to the child, maybe talk them out of this, maybe affirm them, but let's have an open debate. Oh, well, look, that's possible. I mean, I'm not denying that there's inequality between, racial inequality, ethnic inequality. I'm not denying any of that. I'm not denying that there is gender inequality. I think all of these things should be, and if you want to give them credit for anything, it's the fact that they have us all talking about it. I disagree with the approach. Once you acknowledge these inequalities, what steps are then to be taken to rectify them? What's causing them? So let's just go through that whole proper scrutiny. That's what I want. And what I see the woke people doing is they're saying, no, only our way, and no other way. They declare that the whole society is just a system, it's just a structure of keeping people in power, and they want to maintain their power. So the solution to our problems of every kind of conceivable inequality is to bring down the whole thing. And that I find a tad too extreme. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a whole complex set of factors, globalization. What is my national identity? What am I going to do about immigration? The financial crisis of 2008, other economic factors, the planet, all of these issues are incredibly complex and incredibly important. And we cannot tolerate it that we have groups of people who are sabotaging it, throwing out simple answers, and basically hijacking the space where we share ideas and we exchange ideas and we debate, the universities, schools, the marketplace of ideas. And that is what I see the woke doing. And I see this in our universities in America. It's possible that the problem hasn't come to Switzerland, but I have students telling me, I cannot express myself because I'm afraid. And usually it's a small minority, and they come and they silence everyone else. They make people miserable. They get professors fired. And not only that, they destroy their reputations. They put people's home addresses on the internet so that they can be harassed and worse. It's that kind of behavior that I think is intolerable. I agree exactly with you. We need self-discipline, we need tolerance, we need to be able to listen and argue and hear the counter-arguments. We need to leave our emotions at home when we come to the marketplace of ideas. It's exactly what I used to tell the Islamists. You leave your religious sensibilities at home if you want to have an argument, if you want to have an exchange of ideas. And the woke are not doing that. They're very, very self-righteous, and they behave in a very, very intolerant way. And I think it's time to call them out.
By limiting their free speech?
No, by subjecting them to free speech, by asking them questions, by saying, you see, I understand you're offended, but I'm going to ask the question again. Here is the data. So we talk a lot about, we're obsessed with race in America. There are two schools of thought on why there is racial inequality. I've spoken to a number of very successful Black Americans, and the things that they say and the data that they put forward is data that can't be discussed in our mainstream media. It can't be discussed in universities. Those people, those successful African Americans who want to tell you what made them successful under the same circumstances, they're not allowed to have a voice. I find that frightening, and it makes me angry. And I want to tell the people who want to stop that, to say, I don't care if you're offended or not. I would like to listen to Shelby Steele. I would like to listen to Thomas Sowell. I would like to listen to all the other successful Black Americans, not just to Michelle Obama, and not just to Oprah Winfrey, and not to just the people, Ibrahim X. Kendi and others, who are saying only racism can explain, and only through victimhood can we get ahead. I don't find that a satisfactory explanation. I want to be able to say it. So I'm not saying silence them. I'm saying question them. And if questioning them offends them, then let's offend them. Sometimes it's good to do that. So I started my talk with 1989 when the Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader, had, a complete powerful grip on power in Iran. And so fast forward today, I think it is good news, at least for those of us who study radical Islam, whether it's Shia or Sunni, it's good news to say, look, human beings, regardless of who they are and where they come from, they don't like repression. And sooner or later, they're going to revolt against it. So when I look at this revolt, I'm filled with optimism. With the revolt in Iran, I also see another feature, which is the women would not be able to throw their headscarves on the fire and demonstrate the way they're demonstrating if they weren't backed by their male relatives, if they didn't have the endorsement of their fathers and their brothers and their uncles and their cousins and so on. So in that sense, I think that's another thing to be very optimistic about. I've also seen other changes. I'm not here, obviously, to talk about that subject, but I see other very positive trends. For instance, the government of Saudi Arabia has abolished the vice and virtue police. So you can't run an economy if you're policing the thoughts of people. And I think that realization is setting in different parts of the Middle East, and that's something to be celebrated. I have never had more Muslim friends than I have today, and they're genuine friends. And these are dissenters. And a story that is not being told in public is just the sheer number of people who are born within Islam and who are asking questions and who are dissenting. I'm not saying they're all leaving the faith. Some of them are not. But these are all very optimistic trends, and I think that is why asking questions and scrutinizing and offending the people in power or the people who are seeking absolute power is fruitful. So that's a very good question. I think that's the key question, actually, is what are we going to do about this? And so given the fact that this woke ideology it just crept up and crept in. It took us by surprise. Let me speak for myself. It took me by surprise. I would say in universities, I think you have to enforce as explicitly as possible, almost like the way Christians pray before every meal. I think you want to say in almost every class, we are here to inquire, to understand, to exchange ideas, to learn, to criticize. And then make it, it's like a disclaimer, make it as plain as possible that all ideas, all propositions are welcome, all viewpoints are welcome, and that we seek to discredit what is false through a very rigorous process of trying to understand the logic, the coherence, etc., and not through emotion. And I think if you apply that in the university, you will return these people back to the fringe. I think it is up to everybody to decide what they want to call themselves and how they regard themselves. But I think it's wrong to force people to say things and to say things that they don't want to say. So we've had very big cases. I think there was a case and it went to the courts and the professor won, but the professor was forced to use they instead of he or she, and I think there's a story in Canada about something like that. I think for the student to want to be whatever he or she fancies, that's fine. I'm not going to question that. But to force the professor or other students to use pronouns that they don't want to use, I think that's intolerant. If I'm not convinced that men get pregnant. But this, I know it sounds completely mad, but in America, we're having these discussions. We have a Supreme Court nominee who is asked, can you define a woman? And she says, I can't, I need the experts to come in. The opposition leader in the United Kingdom, and they're about to have an election, he probably will win with a landslide. But he's been asked on the media, what is a woman? And he froze. It's that kind of intolerance. I mean, we're going mad. Because a small minority of people are making us say things and believe things for which there is no evidence. I'm not persuaded that men can get pregnant.
Ayaan, thank you very, very much for your crystal clear and courageous statements. Before I may hand over to the other Christoph, please join me with another round of big applause for Ayaan.